Hi, I'm Chris.
And I'm Sean, and this is Weather Booth.
Flirting with around freezing temperatures. Should be relatively dry as we go through the night.
Today we're talking about the New York State Mesonet. So what is the Mesonet? So in April of 2014, the state of New York, in collaboration with the Department of Homeland Security and Emergency Services, funded the University at Albany to design, install, and operate the New York State Early Warning Weather Detection System. New York State Mesonet, which is a network of 126 weather stations across the state, with at least one site in every county and borough. Each of the 126 stations measures temperature, humidity, wind speed and direction, pressure, solar radiation, snow depth, and soil information, and a lot more. Operated by the University at Albany, the New York State Mesonet collects, archives, and processes data in real time every 5 minutes.
We are joined today by Nick Bassill, who is a local meteorologist who works with the Center of Excellence. Welcome to the Weather Booth, Nick.
Hi, thanks for having me.
No problem. So, what is your role in the Center of Excellence?
So I'm the Director of Research and Development at the UAlbany Center of Excellence, and I've been there for a couple of years now. And before beginning that position, I was a postdoc with the New York State Mesonet. So my office is in the New York State Mesonet, but I'm technically working for the Center of Excellence.
Okay. And I'm supposing your role in the Mesonet website is more attributed to when you previously worked with the New York State Mesonet?
Yeah, so the background to that is that I was hired to do some modeling when the Mesonet was getting installed. So before we even had any stations, I was working on that. And when we were installing the network, it was kind of all hands on deck to do the actual physical installation and collect the data. And there wasn't a place for someone to make maps of the data and make plots and just do fun stuff. And so I filled that role while everyone else was busy working on making sure that we were actually getting data. So I started making some maps and stuff, and so that might be what you know me from. But some of those maps transitioned into the official website when finally things settled down and our software engineer can put stuff on the official website. But I still like to make some sort of maybe a little less public friendly, but more meteorological friendly maps to put on a website.
Mm-hmm. So was the Mesonet created to just have a more high definition forecasting for New York State?
So it's mostly for situational awareness, but with an eye towards the climate. So when Hurricane Irene happened, there was a lot of flooding in the Catskills and other areas of the state. And if you look at the available ASOS network, you'll see that it's pretty much Long Island and New York City, and then the Hudson Valley, and then not a whole lot once you move upstate. So it was designed to kind of fill in those gaps. And they had a plan for what a network could be, but hadn't been implemented yet. And then Hurricane Sandy hit the year afterward. And with the Hurricane Sandy supplemental relief bill, we got money to install it. Obviously, that was before I wasn't here when Hurricane Sandy happened, but the idea is that when something like that is happening, we have a lot better knowledge of what's actually happening across the state, and that eventually, if it's here long enough, we'll be able to start talking about how the climate is changing in every place in the state.
It's awesome.
So I know you mentioned how one of the main goals is to see the changing of the climate, but are there other long-term goals you have with the Mesonet as well as research you can acquire from it?
Yeah, there's all kinds of kind of neat things that I wouldn't have necessarily thought of when I started, but things like you put yourself in the shoes of, say, a utility who's interested in how often does blank area get wind gusts of a certain speed, or maybe you're on a ski hill and you're interested in how much frozen precipitation falls in my county every year, or maybe you work in transportation and you're trying to classify how severe winters are, but the nearest ASOS site is 4 counties away or something like that. So there's all kinds of different specific, applications you can try to do that I'm sure there are more I don't even know about and haven't thought about, but someone will think about eventually.
Yeah, it seems like there's definitely many ways that the information can be applied. So how do you think it could be used for like real-time storm development, like hour by hour, minute by minute?
So I think the best way that it can be done, and the way that I've been doing it so far, is just using it in comparison with forecasts. So if you're using, say, the HER high resolution model to predict your storm evolution this afternoon or something like that, that outputs things that you're probably looking at, like radar reflectivity or peak wind gusts or surface dew point, something like that. One of the ways that we do then is to take those HER forecasts and just compare them with the latest Mesonet observations, because if the Mesonet observations are on track with what the HER forecasts are predicting, then you could probably think that the HER forecasts are going to be good going forward. But if they're really wrong, then that's probably telling you maybe something's not quite right. Another thing is just sometimes if you look at a line of storms, sometimes they look severe and sometimes they don't. And just having that kind of ground truth of, are we actually seeing big wind gusts from them, or are they just, sort of run-of-the-mill 30-mile-per-hour wind gust type storms?
Have you had any interesting findings from the Mesonet, like something like you really hadn't expected after it was installed?
Wow, there are so many answers I can give to that one. Yeah, here's a few. I mean, a lot of really neat topographical effects that we wouldn't necessarily have considered. Sites that are maybe in a valley or on the side of a hill, or there's a site in downstate New York along the Massachusetts and kind of by the Massachusetts, Connecticut, New York triple point. And that particular site, if there are southeasterly winds, they get really strong kind of standing waves where they get crazy gusty when no other site is gusty. So that's kind of interesting. One thing that might shock you is that the Mesonet cameras have seen 2 water spouts and not from the same camera. So that would be something that I would never have guessed, because obviously almost all of the sites are over land. I mean, they're all on land, but they pretty much all look at only land. So 2 of the few sites that actually have a view of Great Lakes each have seen a water spout.
I have never seen a water spout.
Yeah, I haven't either. And so, I mean, it's off in the distance, obviously, because they're not like right at the shoreline, but still.
Mm-hmm. I guess we also don't look out our windows all day and look for water spouts.
Yeah.
So
right.
That's pretty cool. Is there any new patterns discovered as far as I guess squall line, I guess hurricanes, tropical cyclones, or anything of the sort?
Well, one thing that, and this might have been, kind of known to meteorologists who lived in New York their entire lives, but when we see say a squall line moving through the state from west to east, a lot of times especially if it's along a cold front, you can see it bow out in the Mohawk Valley, which is kind of neat. So it's a lower elevated spot, so you get cold air kind of surging out ahead. And then the Mohawk itself can sort of channel the winds to be a little stronger if they're west to east. So that's a little bit interesting. For hurricanes, probably, I feel bad saying hurricanes is what got me into meteorology. So from a purely weather science perspective, I think it's really interesting if we can observe them with the Mesonet, although obviously the damage isn't great. But for something like Isaias, which caused a ton of damage over the summertime, one thing that's kind of neat is we can look at the Mesonet observations and look at that history of wind direction and wind speed and wind gusts, and say for something like Isaias, okay, the damage was caused because they had 70-mile-per-hour wind gusts out of the southeast, which is a direction that we don't commonly see. I don't know that you necessarily needed a Mesonet to say that, but it's kind of neat that we can quantify it a little bit more.
Does the Mesonet, does it help you forecast like super short term for let's say a severe weather event?
In super short term, I'm assuming you mean like the next
like
15 minutes or something like that.
yeah,
Or
on
an
the
hour.
order of magnitude of like 1 to 3 hours or something.
Yeah, one thing that I look at a lot for that is trying to get an estimate of where cold pools might be. So I plot things like what's the the peak 1 hour pressure rise or something along those lines, because a lot of times we see that if there's a convective event that has a really strong cold pool where that 1 hour peak change was on the order of 5 millibars, that's a good sign that there's going to be some strong wind gusts associated with that. So that's definitely one way that we've done it. Other ways, a little bit less used, but the Mesonet has a profiler network. So there are 17 sites that have an instrument called a LiDAR that scans up, and the idea is that it gives you a pretty good estimate of the wind direction and strength at really not every 100 millibars, but every say 50 meters, 100 meters. So in really big severe weather events like the May 15th, 2018 event, looking at that profile of winds, you see a really nice veering wind profile that's indicative of thunderstorms. And so we can look at that. That helps as well.
How does the data resolution for the Mesonet compare to other regions like different states or even internationally?
That's a good question. So I think the relatively agreed upon standard for Mesonets is we collect and disseminate data every 5 minutes. And so that's what the Oklahoma Mesonet is. I don't quote me on this, but I think that's what the Kentucky Mesonet is, and North Texas Mesonet, and some other things are. For ASOS, we get data every hour or special observations, or you can get some crude observations every 5 minutes that are routed to the nearest Celsius and don't necessarily have all of the information. For the Mesonet, we report out every 5 minutes, but we actually grab all of the data in between. So an example of that is our sonic anemometer collects wind data every 3 seconds. So that 5 minute observation, the gust is just the peak 3-second observation over that 5 minutes. And then the sustained is that average of the 5 minutes. But we still record all of that 3-second data. So if you really wanted to do like a really deep dive into wind changes on a second level basis, you can do that kind of thing.
Interesting. Do you know offhand if other countries like Canada or European countries have similar networks?
Yep. I know Quebec has a similar network. I think their stations are called like Climate Sentinels or something like that. They're kind of like Mesonet sites, but they have a little bit more Canadian specific things like freezing rain detectors and a few other specialized instruments that we don't have. But then they're missing a few other things that we have. So it's kind of a trade-off. But so I know Canada has something like that, although I don't think it is in all of Canada. I think it's more of a Quebec thing. But for other countries, I'm honestly not sure about that. Although I would imagine that, and I'm just guessing here, but that there are similar networks in Europe. And I say that only because almost all of the instruments that we bought for the network are made by companies that are in Europe. So I'm assuming they exist there for a reason.
But I know the Oklahoma Mesonet has a detector to see how comfortable cows and cattle would be in the weather. Do we have something similar to that here?
Yeah, they have like a cattle comfort index or something along those lines. So I don't think that is a specific measurement, as in, they have like a cattle comfort-ometer or something like that. But it's a combination of existing variables like temperature, sunshine, wind speed, moisture, and that kind of thing. That's things like that are kind of like the next group of things that I want to think about making that growing degree days. We're basically spring now, so we're getting close to when people are going to be planting things, and depending on different plants or crops, there's different metrics that people use to kind of keep track of, when to plant or when to harvest and that kind of thing. So that's kind of the next group. Things like a variable that I'm somewhat new to, wet bulb globe temperature, which is basically heat index if you consider sunshine. So like if it's 90 over 75, it feels bad at 8 p.m., but it feels really bad at noon if you're outside in the bright sun. So that kind of thing is another one that we're thinking about. So long story. I guess we don't have some of those things right now, but they're obvious kind of next things to add.
How long does it take for data to be collected with the network for it to be useful for climatological records?
Yeah, that's kind of a subject of debate. So we've had a record about 5 years now. The first site got installed in mid 2015. The very last site got installed in early 2018, but that was unusually late. Most got installed in summer of 2016. So we're basically at about 5 years right now. There have been studies that have tried to look at this just because we know that the climate is changing rapidly. And if you look at a 30-year history, the last 10 years of that 30 years might not really be similar to the first 10 years of that 30-year history. So people have tried to quantify that. Basically, how long do we need for a climate record? It seems like the answer is probably less than 30 years, but it depends what you're looking at. If it's something like a reoccurrence interval of an extreme rainfall event, you probably do need a really long record. If it's something like temperature or just maybe generic yearly precipitation, you can probably get away with a little bit shorter of a network. For us, I actually plot up departures from normal, and it's not normal from our Mesonet sites, but what I did is I took all of the available climate sites in the state and then just built a really simple model that normalized according to elevation, latitude, longitude, and distance from a major water body to estimate what our expected temperature should be for a given Mesonet site today, and then use that as a crude way to estimate, how far are we away from normal or not. I'm still doing that. Eventually, I'll probably switch off and do some actual calculations with the actual Mesonet data to figure out normals. But I feel like 5 years is probably not quite. We're probably not quite there yet in terms of having long enough record.
Yeah. Well, pretty soon, I think. Well, I don't know. I'm just a student, but
Well, and
soon.
that's the thing that I try to impress upon people is that, one observation is great, but every future observation also makes all of the past observations more valuable, because that means that there's just that little bit extra of ability you now have to put everything into context. And so, if I had a 30-year record versus a 1-year record, obviously for the next new observation, I can now put that into better context with a 30-year record. So.
Yeah, that makes sense. How does the data you collect play into like information as for weather in the Northeast? Like, do you give data to the National Weather Service or other states or countries?
Yeah, so the data from the Mesonet goes into a data feed called MADIS, and in that feed, are ASOS observations, there's other Mesonets, there's aircraft observations, there's buoy observations, all kinds of stuff. And then that gets fed directly to the Weather Service and NCEP and anyone else like that. But it is classified according to a certain level of security that is basically like a government only. So a private company, if they were getting that feed, the data would be restricted, and that's only to try to encourage people to work with us. You may or may not know, but the Mesonet was paid to have it installed, but there was no dedicated money to have it maintained. So we're kind of continuously at risk of losing the ability to maintain it, which would obviously be very bad because we effectively lose the observations. So really, that's just kind of a way to help us work with groups and get something back for all the work that people are putting in to make it available. but state agencies have historically been able to get it as well. So, the Homeland Security, the police, and all those kind of groups, if they need it, they get it for free. There's not, like a charge, and as far as I know.
What is the weirdest request you've ever gotten for Mesonet data?
Oh, so I think the simplest answer is probably there was one person who requested data to settle a bet, and I don't recall what the bet was. I don't even think he or she said what the bet was, but apparently they had a bet. Here's a weird one that's not weird as in it's like bad or anything, but just weird, something that I never would have thought of. So I mentioned that the wind data is every 3 seconds, at least for the sonic anemometer. An HVAC company who installs like air conditioners on rooftops and all of that kind of thing was curious to know how frequently you get streaks of a certain length of 17 meter per second gusts or higher. So basically how many 3-second gusts or how many 3-second observations in a row were 17 meters per second or higher, because apparently if it exceeds a certain amount, then that creates a vacuum of sorts on the vents, and then that prevents the HVAC from being able to work well. So stuff like that, I would just have never, ever thought about unless someone asked about it. I'm sure there's all kinds of other things that I don't think of, that I'm not thinking of. Pretty routine things are agriculture. Something that's also pretty routine is people who like design culverts and want to know, what the heaviest rain rate is, because they are calculating how much water can flow through a given culvert size and stuff like that. Yeah, there's all kinds. I'm sure I'm missing like a dozen really interesting requests.
Oh, it's interesting, especially the air conditioning one.
Yeah.
I wish they could get some help with it.
Yeah.
How much maintenance does the Mesonet need, and how often are sensors repaired, and the maintenance costs?
Yeah. So we have a crew of several field techs who are responsible for different parts of the network or different areas of the state, and we visit every site routinely twice a year. So if nothing bad happened, they'd still be visited every 6 months or so, just to clean off instruments and just kind of do a visual check. But if the sensor goes down, one of us pretty much knows it right away, and then we'll issue what we call internally as a trouble ticket. So basically an email gets sent out to everyone saying, hey, blank instrument is down, and then someone will try to go fix it as soon as possible. Sometimes it's a little bit harder to diagnose if it's a temporary thing, like maybe a pressure sensor. This happens a lot in the winter, where the tube to a pressure sensor has melted water drip into it, and then it freezes, and then the pressure goes bad for a day, but then it thaws and it's fine, so we don't really visit it. But in the summertime, the grass needs to be cut, because if you don't cut the grass and you're measuring 2-meter air temperature, but the grass is more than 1 meter tall, well, now you're not really measuring 2-meter air temperature anymore. You're kind of measuring like 1 meter air temperature. So we try to cut the grass pretty frequently. So a given site is probably visited half a dozen or a dozen times per year. So it's frequent.
Yeah.
And that, I think you asked, how much goes into that. And so I think the maintenance and just kind of ongoing maintenance budget for the Mesonet is about $1.5 million per year. But that includes salary and costs of maintaining computers and all of that kind of stuff too.
I know I've been working with the Mesonet with the ASRC, and I guess for one of the sites that I've been working on, I noticed the camera angle changes just slightly. Yeah. Every few months or so.
Yeah, it's funny you mention that, because we're doing an AI project where we're trying to work with some REU students to basically see what we can get out of the camera images, if we can get a little bit more out of them, like trying to detect precipitation type or maybe visibility or cloud cover percentage or something like that. But one of the challenges, as you just noted, is the camera angle. It's pretty fixed, but it's not perfectly fixed. And part of the reason, is wind will shake a little bit. Part of it is maybe we decide there's a better view a different direction, so we kind of point it in a different direction. Another thing is snow might accumulate on the camera and then push it down a little bit, or maybe even accumulate high up on the tower and then fall down. On that note, we're actually, as part of our spring pass of all of the sites, they're installing a small little kind of like shield over the camera that will be designed to help prevent falling snow from really impacting it. So that might help a little bit, but yeah.
Yeah. Could you show us any plots from
Sure.
the Mesonet you've worked on or made?
Sure, I'd be happy to. Let me share my screen here. Yeah, so this was that website that I said I put together back before we were making maps of anything. So this is not the official website, just to be clear. This is has a little bit more sort of specialized, functions. There's the basic temperature and pressure kind of plots. But we got a lot of requests, especially from the DOT and other groups that have very specific things, or even the National Weather Service is very interested in fire weather. So just kind of knowing how many factors we're meeting sort of fire weather danger. So that's what this kind of thing might be. I'm just giving a smattering example of some different things, but another one that is sort of interesting is soil moisture. So soil moisture, we measure at 3 different levels, but it's not like temperature where a value of 72 here is the same as the value of 72 out in Buffalo. Soil moisture depends on the kind of soil. So if it's sandy soil versus clay, a given value might mean something very different, which makes it really hard to make a map of, because they're not comparable, so you can't really contour it. So instead, what we've done is sort of put it into context where instead of plotting the raw values, plot the historical percentile. So basically, what is the current value in the context of all of the other values in history at that site? And that makes it a little bit more comparable at something like this. One of my favorite things is looking at records, basically making any kind of record that you might be interested in. So something like high temperature records are fairly straightforward. So this is basically a map of the highest observed temperature at every site, and then the sort of colored circles on the outside attempt to group them by event day. So the red day here is the most common day that a record high temperature has been set, which was 2020 July 9th. So that was the day where it was the biggest sort of event day in history. But all kinds of other sort of fun records. Like one of my let's see, I'm trying to think of one of my maybe fun records, but like a minimum diurnal temperature range. The minimum diurnal temperature range that we've seen is 0.97 degrees Fahrenheit, which I think is kind of crazy. But so just all, kinds of weird things like that. And since I mentioned it, I mentioned talking about temperature anomalies. So this is a map of our estimated temperature anomaly from yesterday. So again, this is not based on where on the historical data from each Mesonet site. It's based on other observations that do have a 30-year record in New York, and then sort of converted to Mesonet sites using just a really simple, pretty algorithm. So we can look at things like, a 90-day temperature, mean temperature anomaly, and it's been pretty warm. The issue, since I'm bringing this up here, is sites that are maybe not typical, like this one right here. This really stands out, and that's on a very tall skyscraper in New York City. And so that conversion doesn't work very well for that particular site. And this one right here is on the side of a mountain on Whiteface Mountain. So that site, again, also doesn't really work too well with this sort of thing. But since I mentioned earlier about sort of putting forecasts like the HER into context of what the Mesonet was observing, I can show an example here of how we might do that. So create a time-lagged HER ensemble. So basically, if at noon, say, every HER run that has a valid forecast for noon, we'll take that and say that that's our ensemble. So we can do things like look at temperature, and this is a ensemble mean temperature forecast. But then we can compare all of the Mesonet sites' temperature here. In this case, at 10 a.m., it's always lagged about an hour so that we can compare it to what happened. And then down here, you see the raw difference. So this plot on the lower right shows the difference between the Mesonet observation and the HER forecast, the HER mean forecast. So in this case, 25 of the sites, the HER mean was exactly that temperature, and 31 were above it and 69 were below it. So, they nothing too big to write home about there. But sometimes you do see some really big differences, like this time of year. I don't know if we're going to see it here, but no, we don't. But things like dew point and relative humidity, models notoriously struggle with this sort of transition period where the snow is basically gone and then the ground is bare, yet there are no plants, there's no leaves. So a lot of times during this period, high resolution models struggle and think that it is too moist. We're not quite into that regime yet, but that can also have bad implications on forecasts. And so that's one of the things that I probably should have mentioned earlier when looking at this kind of thing. So incidentally, you can see in the HER forecast here that they very clearly highlight the Mohawk Valley in terms of a spot with a local minimum in forecast dew points, and have a higher forecast for things like the Adirondacks or maybe parts of the southern tier. And presumably that's because there's more snowpack in that type of region.
These are some really cool plots.
Yeah.
I visited this site a few times. I didn't even know half of this existed. It's really awesome.
Yeah, it's right here. Another one of my favorite kind of plots, and this has been really useful for flooding forecasts, and this is flooding analysis, and this has been requested by the National Weather Service. But things like, so comparing what the radar says occurred for precipitation, which is in the fill here, with what actually occurred based on Mesonet observations. And so the idea here is that both the dots and the fill use the same color scheme. So right here is shown 72-hour precipitation. So the idea here is that if there is a dot that has a color that is very different from the underlying fill pattern, or vice versa, that tells you that the Mesonet is giving information that we cannot get from radar. So for example, this site right here, I think, so if I hover over it, it says they got 1.09 inches of precip in the last 72 hours. Yet that blue color right behind it is, maybe half an inch. So that's an example of, an inch is not going to cause flooding, especially because it was a very drawn out rain event that we had the other day. But in events like the Halloween flood of late 2019, we were observing rainfall over 24 hours in this area on the order of 6 or 7 inches in 24 hours, whereas radar alone was only saying 3 inches. So the Weather Service was able to use that information to say, hey, there's probably a lot more flooding here than we might think based on radar alone, and issue flash flood warnings and that type of thing that hopefully help save some lives and property. So I like to say that if there's a map you're looking for with the Mesonet, chances are I've made it. So if you're thinking of something, let me know, because I might have made it and I could share it.
That's pretty awesome. I don't have any specific requests right now, but
one of my favorite ones to look at, and I think if I look at page views, I think this is the most looked at one, is the camera map and radar. So there's nothing, the radar is, there's nothing going on in the radar right now, but this is real. I use this all the time if there's severe thunderstorms, or if I think that there might be, like really nice cloud structure. So I'll animate this, and it's not going to look like anything animated because there's no radar going on right now. But if there's a line of storms moving through, most of these cameras are pointed north, so you can kind of get a sense, hey, if there's a big thunderstorm, say right here, I might click on this camera image so that I can look, I can look to see if there's any cool storm structure. So that's something that I like to do. And then finally, I guess there's an archive of a bunch of this stuff. I don't archive this one, but there's an archive of a bunch of other kind of things. For situational awareness, we made this for the Division of Homeland Security here in the state. Because when there's an ongoing weather event, they're always needing to give out where was the peak wind gusts, where was the most rainfall, how much rain fell yesterday, all that kind of thing when someone like the governor or a different state agency asks. So we made this to give them sort of like an all-in-one. They can put it up on a big board somewhere and not have to hit refresh, and it'll just change automatically. But it gives them options of, they can mess around with it and look at different kinds of things, like maybe put a county map up instead, or look at peak wind gusts instead, or whatever they want to do. They can just kind of play around with it, and whatever they want to do, they can do kind of different things and throw it up there.
That is honestly, that's probably one of the coolest websites. I didn't even know everything it did because there's so many buttons.
Yeah,
tabs.
I know there's so many buttons, and this is like it's a little. I keep adding to it because people ask about it, but like the Weather Service has made basically half the requests for something in here. But I also make things so I'm like, hey, that's something I want to see. It's, as a meteorologist, I want to be able to look at, I don't know what it is, but something like a winter weather summary, which is really boring right now, but something like I want to see a certain collection of variables together, and it's not necessarily very public friendly, but it's friendly for us meteorologists. So yeah, don't really know what else that's like super interesting to plot here. One thing that I added last year that I want to look at a little bit more is basically lightning, cloud to ground lightning. So it's obviously not something observed by the Mesonet, but just kind of like an interesting thing. It's been no lightning strikes in the last 24 hours, obviously, but in severe weather events, it can be pretty interesting. Individual site records. So like if I mentioned that there's a records page, but if you go to an individual site, and there's a whole long list of, when did what records. So at Voorheesville, the minimum dew point was -22, set at 12:10 UTC on February 1st of 2019. And you can even go and look at the meteogram for that day and say like, oh, yep, that's where the minimum dew point happened right there. Just for kind of, that's more like for fun. I don't necessarily know, other than kind of data quality analysis, that's particularly useful, but stuff like that's kind of neat. So
That's awesome. So what research, I know you guys talked about, or you talked about a little bit about the cloud detection and precip detection, but is there any other research the Mesonet is working on?
Yeah, there's a whole bunch. So the Mesonet itself, as in just the people specifically in the Mesonet, do research, although it's a lot of it is kind of student led, just because the people who are working in the Mesonet have, quote unquote, a regular job, and the regular job is to make sure that the Mesonet is operating, going smoothly. So there is some research that's done in the Mesonet, but a lot of it is done by people like me or faculty in DAES or ASRC who use Mesonet data with their grad students or with the Weather Service or so on. So a lot of it is in energy or utilities, that kind of, renewable energy is a really big thing. So there are faculty members at ASRC who are doing renewable energy stuff. I use Mesonet data for outage modeling for utilities, something they're really interested in. But it's kind of the sky is the limit because the data set is so dense. We don't really have, we haven't even really scratched the surface of the kind of things you can do with it, especially with camera data, as I mentioned earlier, and you just mentioned. So, one of the things that we're proposing to do is to do things like look at urban heat island effects in New York City, because we have a dense network of observations there. You can do things like a lot of stuff with winter weather. We have arguably the best snow drifting observation network in the world, which is something that maybe you might not think about as being too important, but blowing snow is a big concern for transportation. The Mesonet has a snow depth sensor, it has a camera, and it has a wind sensor, and obviously temperature and all that kind of stuff. And so the snow depth sensor will basically catch snow drifts in real time, because it's just pointed down and it measures how far away the snow is. And so if you have a snow drift, it kind of moves through. And so doing research on that is interesting. Brian Tang and I have done research on predicting, very high localized gusts. Basically, what gust would you think would happen for a given sustained wind and regime? Really, it's hard to list all of them. There's so many.
I'm sorry, I can't wait to see how far this develops over the next few decades or so, and see what really comes out of this.
Yeah, one of the things that we had a small comet project that just wrapped up, and we had a student who was working on trying to relate the soil moisture that I mentioned to flash flood events, because having this kind of soil moisture network is not, that other states don't really have that, with the exception of, Oklahoma and a couple other mesonets. And so that data is not something that the Weather Service is used to looking at, but they know it's probably valuable. So we're trying to figure out how can we relate, soil moisture measurements to flash flooding. And that's the kind of thing that is possible, but you need a long record for it, because you don't have that many flood events. And flood events kind of by their nature are very localized. Maybe your street is flooding and my street doesn't. So that's the kind of thing where we're going to need another decade or so to say, like, okay, now we have enough events where we can start looking at this sort of thing.
So how can students get involved with the Mesonet?
That's a great question. So there's a whole bunch of ways. There's the Operations Center routinely has students working in it, either for credit or as like an honors thesis or project, or even paid interns. And those people generally are there to be there for when the field techs call. So if they're at a site, they'll call up and say, hey, I just swapped out this instrument. Can you confirm that we're collecting data again? That sort of thing. And then in their spare time, when they're not doing that, they might do some, kind of like a little research project. There are other ways that you can be involved in the types of projects that I just mentioned, so those sort of research projects that other faculty and people are doing that maybe aren't specifically working directly at the Mesonet, but work with the Mesonet data itself, or maybe the camera data or that kind of thing. So if you or someone, or you have someone in mind who's interested in working with Mesonet data, I'd encourage them to reach out to me or Jerry Brodsky, the program manager, or Chris Thorncroft, the director, and we can try to figure out a way that they can be involved. Really, there's so much stuff there that it's pretty easy to just say, like, hey, here's a CSV file of, temperature data. Why don't you look at it and see if there's anything cool in there? That's maybe a little simplified, but you get the idea. There's there's more than we could possibly look at. So we're not going to run out of ideas. So, if it's a freshman or even a high school student who is just interested in weather but doesn't have any programming or really, knowledge of how meteorology works, there's still a lot there that you can play around with.
Thank you. Definitely sounds like there's a lot of opportunities for weather enthusiasts of all levels.
Yeah, on that note, we've worked with a number of schools in a variety of capacities, both to get their some of their earth science curriculums to use Mesonet data, but a number of the sites are located at schools. So the schools like to take, mini field trips out to the site to kind of teach them about weather collecting. Center of Excellence has done projects doing forecasting for schools for better snow days. We actually have a website for the entire SUNY system to use to better predict or prepare for snow days. And that uses a little bit of Mesonet data. So there's a whole variety of ways that we're connected to schools that probably people don't realize.
Thank you so much for joining us today. Chris, do you have any more questions?
Not that I know of. Do you have any other comments or I guess anything you want to say?
Yeah, I guess I would just add that the Mesonet is really, it's obviously a great resource. We're always wanting to look out for it in the long term, and so one of our goals is to try to get people to use it, and part of that is the state. And so it's kind of funny because we funded a $30 million network to be put here, but there was not really the infrastructure in place to get the state to use it. So it was here, but it might surprise you to learn that most utilities, state agencies, authorities, the Division of Homeland Security here, they don't have meteorologists on staff. And so if you're not a meteorologist, kind of put yourself in the general public persona and then ask yourself, how would you use this data if you weren't a meteorologist? And then obviously the answer is it would be tough, right? So a lot of what we do is try to help those types of groups, say, here's how to use it. I mentioned things like making a dashboard or stuff like that. Basically ask them, what can we do to make the data more usable for you, or to teach you how to use it? And so we have a long way to go on that note, but it's really a resource that probably hasn't been fully utilized by the state in many ways. So I would just end with that that there's a lot more to go there.
Right. We really appreciate you having you on, Nick.
Yeah, thank you for inviting me. It's a lot of fun.
No problem.